Bon, nous allons commencer donc cette session. Merci d'être venu.
So we're going to begin this session, and I'd like to thank you for being here, despite the fact that the night was maybe a bit short. This is the first time that I participated in this seminar. I think it's the first time we've had a session on psychedelic substances. I know it's the second time. All right, the second time. So as you know, psychedelic drugs are back with various titles in the different newspapers, psychedelic medicine, for example, or return to psychedelics. Psychedelics are back. And so we're going to look at this from a historical and a scientific perspective, and also from a therapeutic perspective. And it's a lot of hope, and perhaps even too much hope, that is invested in these. Sometimes we have expectations which may be too high and may be disappointed. But we're going to look at the situation as it is during the morning, and I hope there will be a lot of questions. So without further ado, because we're going to be talking about psychedelics for almost 2 hours, I'd like to hand over to Vincent VERROUST, who is the moderator for this session, and he's a historian of science working on psychedelics, and also president of the French Association of Psychedelics. So I'd like to hand over to him for the moderation of this session. Thank you very much, Joël. Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to welcome you to this panel on psychedelics, which we were really looking forward to. I'm very pleased to have alongside me Professor Matthew Johnson from the University Johns Hopkins of Baltimore, Professor Wim van den Brink from Amsterdam, and we're very pleased to welcome you here today. And I suggest that we should start straight away by asking Joël BOCKAERT to come and speak. He's a French biologist of some reputation. He was trained in Paris, has a doctorate at the Collège de France, and then postdoc at Northwestern in Chicago, and he now teaches and taught in Paris 6. Then he was a research director at the National Research Council in Montpellier. He founded and directed research institutes in Montpellier, a pharmacology and endocrinology research department. He's a specialist of intercellular communication, particularly in the brain, and he has been rewarded by a number of prizes like the Charles Pogmeyer Prize, and he is a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur and is a member of several academies, including the Academy of Science. Today, it's an honor to have him here sharing his thinking on the theme of sérotoninergique psychedelic medication from shamans to doctors. For those of you in the room, the conference will be translated into English and in Spanish for the shamans. Are there any shamans in the audience? No, okay, because we ran out of Mazatec translators, perhaps next year. So let's move over to something more serious, the more profound scientific reflections of Mr. BOCKAERT. Over to you, and we're listening with very great interest. Thank you very much, and thank you for this perhaps excessively laudatory introduction. But I'm not a great specialist of psychedelic medication, but I have been interested in it for some time because I have worked for a long time on serotonin receptors, and you can't work on those receptors, of course, without coming across psychedelics. And for some time now, I have been interested in this with this renewal of psychedelic medicine. So I'm going to here give a rather historical and scientific introduction to the question, and at the end I will relate one experiment of recent work that is currently being published that was done in the laboratory and which raises some interesting questions. This is a publication, a series of publications published in Nature almost exactly a year ago on psychedelic medicine. And here you can find, if you are interested, a whole series of very interesting, very comprehensive articles on psychedelics and seeing how psychedelics are used in medicine. Of course, you can see the slides. You can hear me still? Can you modify the state of conscience with a small molecule like a psychedelic? Of course, a lot of people might smile at this idea. It's a very daring idea. And yet, some of these so-called psychedelic drugs, which can be either of plant origin or synthetic, they do modify states of conscience. They've been known since the dawn of time, and natural psychedelics cause dissolution of the ego, ecstasy, hallucinations, and distortions of reality. And of course, the shamans use this in a number of traditions, and they modify our habitual consciousness. It was Humphrey Osmond, in correspondence with Aldous Huxley, and he proposed the term psychedelic. And the slogan he used was, almost advertising, to understand hell or to glide with the angels, let's just take a pinch of psychedelics. Perhaps it was slightly provocative, but the name psychedelic came from psyche, the spirit, and derun, which means to make visible. So a psychedelic makes the soul visible. And of course, that's a very ambitious program, both for pharmacologists, psychologists, doctors, and so on. I'm just going to look briefly over the different psychedelics. There are three, as you probably know, three major families. The families of the tryptamines. Here you can see, of course, serotonin that you can recognize here, tryptamine, which is the nucleus, a basis nucleus that goes into serotonin, and of course the psilocybin, which you have here, which comes from magic mushrooms, the Mexican ones here, but there are other psilocybins. And psilocybin is not the active ingredient. The active ingredient, after degradation of this phosphate, is psilocin. So you can see these magic mushrooms have been used for a number of years in the traditions, particularly in southern Central America. And you see the famous statues from Guatemala with a very clear representation of a mushroom on the head of certain animals or even human figures. First of all, psilocybin. Magic mushrooms is a tradition in Guatemala and Mexico. They were used in ceremonies called veladas, which serve to treat a certain number of pathologies, but also to find lost friends or objects. After the persecutions by the conquistadors, these ceremonies became extremely secret, and the story that probably many of you know is the story of Richard Gordon and his wife Valentina Gordon, who were very interested in mushrooms, and they had heard about the veladas by some ethnobotanists, and they were very intrigued and they wanted to take part in one of these veladas. It was extremely complicated. It took them a number of unsuccessful journeys until on the 29th of June, 1955, Richard Gordon Watson was admitted to a velada, and the problem was that he published an article, which you may know in Life in 1957, called In Search of the Magic Mushroom, which was read throughout the world and attracted a lot of people to the village where the shaman was. Marina Sabina was the shaman, and a certain number of problems were caused by that. The mushroom itself was named and classified by a French mycologist called Roger Haim from the Natural History Museum in France. And then After the publication, a number of the people from the jet set of the time, a few names here, went to the village, and the result was a bit of a catastrophe. The village didn't particularly enjoy these visits, and Maria Sabina's house was burnt down, and the whole thing ended very badly. Other tryptamines, of course, are also psychedelic. One very important one is dimethyltryptamine, which you can see here with two methyl cations here. You can see in some mimosas, but particularly in this plant here, Psychotria viridis, which has a mixture of the two compounds, because you need to inhibit the MAO for the product to be really active, and it gives this magic psychedelic potion, the ayahuasca, which is very well known, and again has been discussed in the headlines of a number of magazines and newspapers. Another tryptamine, and that's the last one I'm going to be presenting here, there are of course many others, is bufotenine. Bufotenine is an interesting question too. It's a 5-hydroxydimethyltryptamine, as you can see. It's not psychoactive. It doesn't have a psychedelic action. It has to be transformed by O-methyltransferase to produce 5-methoxydimethyltryptamine, which is active. Bufotenine is present in a number of toads or other batracians, but this particular one is only present in this particular toad, and it's only the glands of the skin of the toad that can produce this compound, which is extremely psychedelic, extremely active, because a dose of 10 to 5 milligrams, which is inhaled when the crystals are burnt, can produce psychedelic experiences immediately, and they're very powerful. So this again is a question of fashion, because this toad can essentially be found in the Sonora Desert in the north of Mexico or Baja California, and it's become very fashionable to go into the desert to find these toads to recover the substance. And of course, there are all sorts of issues connected with that. Some very expensive journeys, which are very profitable for those people who organize them, and they organize these journeys around this toad. Then there are the derivatives of phenylethylamine on the serotonin receptors. They can be activated with derivatives of phenylethylamine. The most classical compound of these derivatives of phenylethylamine is this trimoxy, which gives mescaline, which of course you can find in the peyote cactus, which also is featured in a number of shamanic ceremonies. And it's again one of the first psychedelics to be used successfully and used by Aldous Huxley, which he described in The Doors of Perception. The cult of peyote spread through Central America, South America, and then to North America and to the United States. And in 1918, it was officially integrated into the Native American Church in the United States. And the interesting thing here is that the use of drugs for religious purposes is protected by the law in the United States. This is the Religion, Freedom, and Restoration Act, which authorizes religions to use psychoactive substances in their rites. So it's a fairly interesting story. And there are some anecdotes where a priest from this church received a lot of drugs from Central America, and the police had seized those drugs, and he took the state to court to recover these substances, which he did recover, and the state was condemned because of this illegal seizure of drugs destined for the Native American church. So it's quite interesting from a societal point of view. No, I'm not going to spend 3 hours on this. The third class of psychedelics, which of course you all know, derived from ergot, and the most famous one is this one. So modified states of conscience are a mental state caused by different procedures or physiological, psychological, or pharmacological agents, which can be recognized subjectively by the individual himself or by an objective observer of the individual as representing a sufficient deviation from subjective experience or habitual psychological functioning. So it's not a habitual state, and it's a state that's not recognized by the individual. These are substances which are able to reliably cause states of perception or thought or feeling which are not experienced in normal life, except in dreams or in moments of religious ecstasy or oceanic feelings. I don't know if you know what oceanic feelings are. We can talk about that later if you like. Trance, hypnosis, meditation, and so on. So there are a lot of ways of modifying your state of consciousness. There are some standard ways, for example, dreams, but also you could talk about sleepwalking, which is a modified state of consciousness, and of course, other states of modified consciousness, which are caused by procedures like trances, hypnosis, and meditation, and so on, and also pharmacological causes by the substances that we've just been talking about in particular. So how do these psychedelics operate? And that, I think, is what is the most interesting for me. The history is interesting too, but the point of departure of the psychedelic effects is activation of this type of serotonin receptor, the 5-HT2A receptors, which can be found in various networks of the brain, and particular in the visual cortex, the frontal cortex, and the thalamus, and many other regions. It's clear, and you can see that not everything is clear, but what is clear is that the psychedelic effects in animals and humans go through this receptor. Wim van den Brink and his co-workers used specific antagonists, which are very specific for this kind of receptor, and they blocked the psychedelic effects of psilocybin in healthy volunteers. So that's pretty well clear. So once the receptor has been activated, here you can see in 3D, it's a three-dimensional structure. What happens in practically all psychedelics, what happens is that they cause neuroplasticity, which is very easy to see either in a Petri dish or in vivo. What you see is an increase in the number of synapses here and an increase in the number of dendrites. These are prolongations here of the neurons. So there's a whole modification of the neuroplasticity, which is caused by these compounds, which go through the 5-HT2A receptor. What happens then at a higher level is a modification of what we call the default mode network. I don't know if you know this default mode network. It's very important. It's a network which operates in your brain when you're doing nothing, when you have no specific goal, you're not doing any precise activity, not concentrating on anything in particular, when your mind is thinking, perhaps doing nothing in particular, perhaps thinking about your past, your future, your mental state, and your relationships. When you're focused on yourself, self-focused, this default mode network is very active. It actually expends a lot of energy in your brain. As a lot of it is used, a lot of energy in your brain is used when you're doing nothing in particular. I say this to students, they're very happy. So the brain maintains itself and analyzes itself and prepares itself through a kind of self-analysis by activating this kind of network. The interesting thing is that this default mode network is increased in cases of depression and in addiction. That's fairly easy to understand. For depression, of course, you are self-focused, you're ruminating, and of course, there is a kind of self-focus with a very limited opening to the outside world. So the default mode network becomes more active when individuals are focusing on their lack of substances, when they're addicts, also will activate this network. Psychedelic drugs diminish the action of this default mode network. So that's a very general observation, and that might explain quite a number of things in the literature. As you know, probably in the 1960s and 1970s, there was a lot of clinical studies, small-scale clinical studies, very often quite anecdotal, focusing on psychedelics. And actually, the Sandoz laboratory actually gave Deliside free of charge, which was LSD, for therapeutic use. The indications, Osmond used it for alcoholism. It's used in psychotherapies and psychoanalysis. And this made a lot of people rich, particularly in California. Everybody rushed there to get their cure of psychotherapy or psychoanalysis. One of the famous patients was Cary Grant, and he followed one of these psychotherapy cures under LSD, and he wrote a lot, and particularly he said, "So many lost years, why didn't I do this earlier? Now I'm much closer to happiness." And of course, he was very successful with the ladies and so on. So that was an extraordinary argument. It was also used to move to the afterlife and perhaps attenuate the moments before death. Huxley agreed with his wife to be injected with LSD when he was dying so that he could perhaps leave this life in a more pleasant way. A lot of studies have been carried out at that time, and particularly the psilocybin Harvard project with Timothy Leary, which was a catastrophe, and I can't go into the details. And it was interesting, but also a little catastrophic and ended badly. So after all of these attempts, these experiments with LSD, the hippies and so on, and of course the problems that caused, it was forbidden, and psychedelic medicine fell into forgetfulness. It was forgotten largely until some 15 years ago, when it came back into the forefront. There have also been some clinical studies on the effects of psilocybin on a certain number of pathologies, but very often small-scale pathologies. For example, for depression, that is the best known at the moment. In compulsive obsessional disorders, anxiety at the end of life, particularly associated with cancer, addiction to tobacco and alcohol, and migraines, these terrible headaches. In depression, because that is for the moment the most widely recognized indication, the effects are interesting. They're very rapid. The effects are very rapid compared with the classical treatments for depression, less than a week, a few days, and apparently quite persistent because they can last as long as 3 months. They're very often, almost always, associated with psychotherapy. So they reduce the activity of the default mode network, and it's possible that the alteration of perceptions facilitates a new experience of oneself and one's environment and can help to reduce rigid, ruminating thoughts, which can be observed in psychiatric disorders like depression. The most comprehensive clinical trial for depression was published last year by Goodwin and many other authors, working on 22 sites in 10 countries in Europe and North America, with patients suffering from resistant depression, which was resisting classical treatments. The dose was 25 milligrams with psychological support, and they had approximately 30% of participants in remission 3 weeks after and 20% after 12 weeks. The important thing, and which is perhaps problematic at the moment, that these psychotherapies under psilocybin have always been associated with the presence of a psychologist or a psychiatrist at the moment of the injection of the psychedelic. It's what has been called set and setting, and that's been maintained with music and environment, which is not a hospital ward environment and so on, but a pleasant environment. The blind spot here is that the need to have a psychiatrist or a psychologist, or one or two psychologists during the therapy, raises a difficult problem because it's difficult to have all these patients and use this technique because of the demands in terms of staff. The problem for researchers, particularly, is in preclinical trials, is do we need to have a psychedelic state to have the antidepressant effect of these products? For example, could agonists of this receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor, which is the one which is stimulated, at least that's what we thought for the moment, is the psychedelic effect necessary, or would it be enough to stimulate the receptor to have an antidepressant effect? Of course, that would be interesting if you could have a substance acting on the same receptor which could have the antidepressant effects and not the psychedelic effects. A lot of work has been done in this direction. There are some products for that. In mice, and I'm sorry, the studies so far have only been on mice. Some psychiatrists laugh when we talk about depression in mice, but we have to start somewhere. We have to start with mice. In mice, the agonists of 5-HT2A can be found with antidepressant effects without having psychedelic effects. We've used lisuride in the laboratory, which is a 5-HT2A agonist without a psychedelic effect, or also it can function on the D2 receptor. But this compound does have antidepressant effects on the mice and no psychedelic effect. And I'm going to show you that in this next slide. It's the only experiment that I'm going to show you, and I'm going to try and be as clear as I can. We use a depression model, in inverted commas, in mice. This is chronic stress. The mice are placed in water, and for several days, after a few days, the mouse has a depressive form of behavior. If the mouse is then put into a bath and you look at the time that it will swim for, we can see that after the depression and this chronic stress, his immobility increases and will no longer attempt to swim to get out of the water. They just simply float, and their immobility, and that's one of the tests we use. We also use preference for sucrose. I'm not going into all the different situations, but this is the most common case in naive mice. When this stress is imposed, the immobility increases, the mouse becomes depressive. And if we inject DOI, it's an analog. It's a psychedelic, a synthetic psychedelic. You can see that the immobility time is reduced. DOI is active, and we can see that lyseride and psilocybin is active, of course, and reduces the time of immobility, and lyserine too, as well, certainly in this model. Lyseride, which is not a hallucinogen, does have antidepressive effects. When you take a mouse which no longer has 5-HT2A receptors, if they have been genetically invalidated, we can see that, of course, the mouse has the immobility which increases with a naive mouse, but the DOI and lyseride no longer has an effect. And the DOI and lyseride effect does go through the 5-HT2A. But if you do the same thing with psilocybin, we can see that it's still active, even if there are no 5-HT2A receptors. So here, to be short and be a little provocative, an article that's currently being revised, a certain number of products do go through the 5-HT2A receptor. Lyseride, which doesn't have a psychedelic effect, is active, and psilocybin, contrary to expectations, has antidepressive effects, which doesn't go through the 5-HT2A receptor. So here there are two problems. The first problem is that it seems that with mice, there can be antidepressive effects through this receptor without a psychedelic effect, which of course is what a lot of laboratories are looking for. And also psilocybin is a prototype that we thought went through the 5-HT2A receptor in the mouse here, does not appear to go through the 5-HT2A receptor. This is a problem because for both mice and men, when you talk about depression, it's not sure that all depressions go through the same neurophysiological mechanism. And perhaps we could have depressions in which psilocybin might well work through the 5-HT2A receptor, and others where it would not go through the 5-HT2A receptor. That raises another problem of categorization of the state. Depression, if we think that it always works through the same neurophysiological routes, then that's one thing, but maybe it doesn't. So this perhaps changes our perspective for the future and for future discussion. Thank you very much.
Nous avons, je crois, quelques instants pour des questions.
So we have a few moments for questions.
Y a-t-il des questions dans la salle?
Are there any questions from the floor?
Apparemment pas.
Apparently no questions.
Eh bien, nous allons.
So in that case, we're going to move forward to the next presentation. It's an honor to welcome Matthew Johnson, a professor of psychiatry and behavior science at Johns Hopkins University, Baltimore, in the United States. Matthew Johnson is one of the most widely published researchers in the world in this area. Just a few words to introduce Matthew Johnson. Since he obtained his doctorate in experimental psychology, he's dedicated his career to the fascinating area of psychedelics and questions connected with addiction and risk behavior, and particularly published recommendations on safety and psychedelic research on human beings from 2008, a pioneer in the resurrection of this field of research. His first study on the treatment of addiction to tobacco, which is the theme that we're going to be looking at today, was published in 2014, and Professor Johnson has international acknowledgement, not only in psychopharmacology, but also in areas such as as behavioral studies. International Prize for his work on psychedelics, and funding from the NIH as a main investigator since 2009. Professor Johnson will share his precious knowledge in a presentation entitled Psychedelic Therapy for Tobacco Addiction. And just a story, He's interesting to note that Dr. Johnson is a great lover of heavy metal rock, and perhaps a paradoxical musical style, since the research for psychedelics suggests that these substances could be a remedy to suicidal tendencies. Matthew, I'd like to ask you whether, in your view, after a dose of psilocybin, this group could change its name and could become Good Mood or Open Mind or something like that. But we'll perhaps look at something rather more serious and look at the role of this drug in tobacco addiction. Dr. Johnson, over to you.
Thank you, Vincent. That was one of the greatest introductions. I really appreciate that. Very, very individualized. And so really an honor to speak for you, to be asked to speak here by the organizers. Thank you to all of you, especially after a wonderful banquet last night. So appreciate you showing up today. And thank you to, had to say, we'll talk about magic mushrooms, but I think part of the real magic is being able to understand each other across different languages. So thank you to the translators and their hard work. So by way of disclosure, I do serve as advisor to several companies that are developing psychedelics through the FDA and EMA pathway. However, I'm not talking directly about any of those companies or their work today. One of the themes I've been noticing over the 20 years that I've been researching psychedelics is that sometimes we take ourselves too seriously. We're so desperate for people to not believe that we're Timothy Leary, that we're not crazy, this is real science. But sometimes I think we take ourselves too seriously. So I sometimes like to start with a joke or two. Is that okay with you? Okay with a joke? And I did consider sometimes jokes are lost in translation for those not understanding English. So I decided to go with a visual joke. So we'll try this one on for size. I hear a few chuckles when the psychedelic therapy patient panics and asks the therapist how many hours the psilocybin is going to last. Well, for those familiar with the psychedelic state, you can see our friend, the Count from Sesame Street here, is suggesting 8 hours, but then the visual illusion that turns on its side and becomes the infinity symbol, which is not the way you want to deal with a psychedelic therapy patient. That's not the way to minimize the paranoia that we can have. So you heard a lot of the history from Professor BOCKAERT, and I'll just touch on that the mushrooms, psilocybin-containing mushrooms in particular, have been used for really much of history, and even prehistorically. I'm showing you some examples from Mesoamerica and South America dating back several hundred to even 1,000 years ago on the center and on the left. But on the right, I'm showing you perhaps the most ancient evidence. This is from Algeria. And in case you can't see it well, there's about 5, this is from a cave painting. There's 5 little people. Their heads appear to have turned into giant mushrooms. They're holding mushrooms in their hands, and there's mushrooms growing all about the scene. And they're all kind of doing a little dance like this. And maybe I'm reading a little bit too much into it, but you know what it reminds me of? Have you seen the Grateful Dead bears dancing around, maybe on the bumper stickers on the cars, the little dancing bears? Perhaps a little bit like this. Who knows, but this was dated back to 9,000 years ago. That's the approximation. So that's several thousand years before the earliest identified civilizations in Mesopotamia. So that would be the truly prehistorical ancient aspect here. And who knows, their use could go back much further than this. So then we fast forward to that earlier era from the 1940s through the 70s. Intense investigation. It was early, but there was some vigorous work in the area. There were some promising findings for both cancer-related distress, end-of-life anxiety, and also treatment of alcoholism. This is primarily using LSD as the psychedelic. And then we reach the Dark Ages. If you can't see, there's some poor fellow hanging in the town square there for doing something naughty, perhaps studying psychedelics. And despite some early promising findings, there was this decades-long dormancy where really human research wasn't allowed. There was some good non-human animal research that came during that time, but all of the human research stopped for some decades. And that was for a couple of reasons. It was a reaction to, well, there were some really very real casualties. The doses of LSD, when it became popular in the late 60s, they were very high in those days, and there were certainly some casualties amongst the psychiatrically vulnerable and people taking it without the proper guidance. But there's also sensationalism, a failure by the media to distinguish between cautious medical psychological research and the indiscriminate use by young people in more dangerous settings. So for these reasons, the work really stopped in people for decades. And so now we might be in what's called the psychedelic renaissance, the enlightenment of this renewed body of work going back about 20 years. I was lucky to get involved with this work in 2004, right after I obtained my PhD. When discussing this work, I never like to even give a short talk without mentioning there are certainly risks, there are dangers. These are powerful mental tools. And I think it's impossible to have a powerful tool that doesn't have, along with the potential benefit, potential risk. I don't have time to detail all of those risks, but I have made it a focus of my career, so I would refer you to publications from 2008 and 2018, amongst others, where I have described the risks and provided recommended guidelines for mitigating or reducing those risks. And I've also provided recommendations to the FDA and other regulatory agencies such as the EMA in how to regulate these if they are indeed approved as medicines eventually. Two risks that I will mention briefly, probably the most relevant and prominent risks, are that it does appear that people who have a predisposition for psychotic disorders like schizophrenia or active disease states of psychotic disorders, that those people, that there could be for those people, there could be an exacerbation or a worsening of their symptoms or an instigation of symptoms if they're exposed to psychedelics. And then the other risk I'll mention is that for anybody, no matter how healthy, at a high enough dose, one can have what's called the bad trip. So a challenging experience where one has strong anxiety, panic, derealization, and occasionally, it's relatively rare, but occasionally people in public will have an accident, and sometimes they or someone else will get hurt or even have a fatality because they're essentially intoxicated, very intoxicated in public. Not common, relatively rare, but it has happened. So I warn people that these are relevant risks. One area of risk that's typically there for most drugs of abuse that's not there for these classic psychedelics like psilocybin is addiction. So to be clear, in my view, psychedelics can be abused, meaning they can be used in a way that's dangerous to the person or to other people, but they're not drugs of addiction in terms of, by addiction, I mean leading to compulsive drug seeking, where someone says to themselves, oh, I need to stop, but yet they have a self-control problem where then they keep using on a regular basis. And we know that these drugs don't look addictive by the neuroscience in the brain's reward system. We know it from the large-scale surveys, the epidemiology, and from non-human animal models of addiction. So it's quite one thing to say like that classic psychedelics themselves are not addictive, but why would we think they could be treated as addictions where treatments for addiction? So there was this older work, as I mentioned, on alcoholism using LSD, suggesting some early findings. There was one study using LSD to treat heroin addiction that showed some promising findings. That was in the early 70s. So with those early findings combined with some stories, some anecdotes of people overcoming other forms of addiction, it appeared that there may be some cross drugs of abuse, an anti-addiction efficacy that works across different addictive drugs of abuse. And so that's the hypothesis. So I decided over about 15 years ago to pursue this line of research using psilocybin to treat tobacco addiction. And some of us may not even consider tobacco a serious addiction. It does kill more people than all other substances, including alcohol, combined. But it's very interesting because with tobacco, people usually don't have this so-called rock bottom effect where their life is destroyed, like with heavy opioid addiction or heavy alcohol addiction, and their spouse leaves them, this type of thing. But when you look at people's difficulty in quitting, I think it's arguable tobacco is up there with with other highly addictive drugs. So I thought, okay, let's try to see if psilocybin could be brought to bear on tobacco addiction. So first, we just had a small amount of money to do this small pilot feasibility project. It took years to run this because I had to do it on the back burner or kind of on the side, had to run the sessions myself. It was sort of a labor of love, but it took years. But here, I'll describe this study and describe the results. The demographics of the participants, the important parts are they had been smoking on average over 30 years, and they smoked about a pack a day, almost 20 cigarettes a day on average. So, and they all had multiple previous attempts to quit smoking. So they weren't lightweight smokers. They were addicted, heavy smokers. It was a pilot study. It was open label. There was no blinding. It wasn't large enough to look at that. And plus, the first step was to see, is there even any hope that this is a promising line of investigation? So it was a 15-week protocol with weekly meetings. We used cognitive behavioral therapy, which is the main type of talk therapy used to help people quit smoking. This therapy wasn't conducted, the talk therapy wasn't conducted during the actual psychedelic sessions. The talk therapy was in preparation of them quitting and then supporting them after they quit. So after the psychedelic session. And there were 3 psilocybin sessions over an 8-week period, starting at a moderate dose and then moving to a higher dose. And these were pretty heavy doses. Even when you ask people that have used recreationally, these are typically higher than your typical recreational dose of psilocybin. And the first psilocybin session was on their target quit date. This is the date that we assign several weeks ahead of time in which they will attempt to stop smoking. They will have their last cigarette before this psychedelic session. During the psychedelic sessions themselves, there's minimal talking. It's an introspective experience where the person wears eye shades and they're encouraged to focus their attention inward on their experience. They're also wearing headphones through which a musical program is played. In this case, it was largely classical music. And really the people who were in the room, the 2 people in the room are there for support in case there is some strong anxiety. They could take their hand, reassure them verbally that they're going to be okay, that they're being kept safe. So here is one of our 2 biological metrics of success. This is breath carbon monoxide. So it's like a breathalyzer for alcohol, except it's for measuring a byproduct of tobacco smoking. And these are the median levels before the first psilocybin session, and these are the median levels after. Clearly, there's a pre-post difference. You don't have to be a stats wizard to see that. I'll show you the data in some other ways. This is something referred to as a 7-day point prevalence abstinence. So what this means is that by both urine cotinine, which is our other biological measure, and breath carbon monoxide and self-report, at each of these time points, it appears that that person has not smoked during the last week. And so at 6 months, it was 80% of participants were smoke-free. At 12 months, 67%, and at a very long-term follow-up that we added at 30 months, which is 2.5 years, that rate of abstinence was 60%. So these are very high rates. So we were encouraged It's not a randomized trial, so we have to be very limited in our conclusions, but it was very encouraging. One way to describe how encouraged we were is demonstrated by this slide of data. I want you to take this with a grain of salt. Hopefully that translates. This is drawing across different studies, so this isn't an exact comparison, but just to show you what our results look like compared to typical rates, you can use this for consideration. Our results are on the right bar, and this is using a more stringent measure of abstinence than what I've shown you so far. This is continuous abstinence. This means since the target quit date, you haven't smoked a single cigarette, even a puff. So if you smoke one cigarette, by this metric, you're considered a failure, even if you're abstinent for another year. So our continuous abstinent rates were over 50% with this study, and the other most prominent and successful treatments for tobacco addiction are shown there, and they're substantially smaller. So this is just why we considered it worthy of follow-up, this line of investigation. We did a qualitative interview analysis on average 2.5 years after we conducted this study. And we asked people, do you think the psilocybin sessions were part of what helped you quit, if they did quit? And if so, how do you think this worked? Why would this work? And these things I will list are themes that were mentioned by multiple participants. They said the psilocybin sessions provided a persisting sense of interconnectedness, awe, and curiosity. They said it reduced smoking withdrawal symptoms compared to other times that they had attempted to quit smoking. And that there were other positive changes. People claimed increases in altruism and appreciation for aesthetics such as art that somehow they believed helped them quit smoking. And they claimed personal insights into self-identity and idiosyncratic reasons for their own smoking history, their own addiction to smoking. These are some quotes that people provided at that qualitative interview describing how the psychedelic sessions helped them. One person said, primarily, I would say it made me understand that my identity is this construct. So you can think of identifying as a smoker versus a non-smoker. I've learned to be more grateful, which is probably the biggest thing. I was given all these lessons in the session telling me, here's what you need to do so you don't get so depressed. That's very interesting given the comorbidity between affective disorders like depression and addictions, and also given some of the work that's been mentioned using psilocybin for depression. Seeing that which happened during the psilocybin experiences and being reminded of and understanding life as an unspeakably marvelous adventure of existence. So this is sort of something that is so large, it sort of reframes the problem of quitting. It sort of seems smaller in perspective. And someone said, I'm more accepting of myself. Something to note about all of these quotes is that none of them directly relate to smoking. So these tend to be big experiences, that sort of reframe their attempt to quit tobacco addiction. So one question you might ask is, does psilocybin always lead to smoking cessation? Sometimes folks say that they smoke cigarettes during a psychedelic experience. Plenty of people at a Grateful Dead concert say they smoked many cigarettes during a psilocybin trip. Does anyone know cats that claim they like to smoke cigarettes during psychedelic experiences? You might have heard of these people. Well, there are some cats out there that do say this. This is one such cat, said that the psilocybin experience, not only did it not make them quit, they are having a transcendent experience smoking this cigarette. You can tell by the dilated pupils that this cat is on a high dose. So it's a joke, but I just want to make the serious point that we don't have any evidence that there's a direct pharmacological reason for this to work. by the way that psilocybin works at the superficial level in the brain. In other words, the direct receptors that are hit don't involve the nicotinic acetylcholine receptors. It seems that the experience that's biologically mediated can get to the deeper psychological roots of the addiction, and it works in that more deeper psychological way. So given that, it is possible that if someone just wants to smoke during their psychedelic experience and they don't care about quitting, they might really enjoy those cigarettes, and it's not going to automatically make them want to quit, like our friend the cat here. Now I'll tell you about a study that we've recently completed our primary data point from. I'm not going to show you the final sample. We're going to save that for publication that we're going to be submitting in the very near future. But I'm going to show you a sample with most of our participants. It's going to ultimately be 82 treatment-resistant smokers. They've all at this point gotten to their 6-month follow-up. And people were randomized to psilocybin, a single psilocybin experience, or a treatment with nicotine patch. We used the same cognitive behavioral therapy that I described before. It was one psilocybin session. It wasn't a blinded study. There's a lot of debate about the credibility of using blinded treatments. In other words, having a credible placebo condition. I've done a lot of that work. And I'll tell you about some work that we've recently begun using a blinded study to examine tobacco addiction. But for this study, what I really wanted to convince myself that we were onto something was to treat this like a novel psychotherapy. And for those that are familiar with the science of psychotherapies, blinding is not possible. So what do? You take people willing to treat their disorder, they're treatment seekers, and you randomize them to either a known standard, something that we know works with something that's very well investigated, versus the new thing. And so that's what we did here. There's hundreds of studies on nicotine treatment, nicotine replacement treatment, such as nicotine patch for tobacco addiction. And we can randomize people to either that or this novel psilocybin therapy. I'm showing you data here for 61 people, about 30 in each group. And like the pilot study, the important thing here is these were not lightweight smokers. They'd been smoking on average for many years, over 25 years, and they'd smoked on average over 15 cigarettes a day. They all had multiple previous quit attempts. And here are the data that I'm sharing for 61 participants. At the 12-month follow-up, biologically confirmed abstinence rates for the psilocybin group were 52%, and that compares to 27% for nicotine replacement therapy or the nicotine patch. And I will say that 27% at a 1-year follow-up is very good compared to normative literature values for nicotine patch. So I'm proud that we've done a very credible, good job with our nicotine treatment arm, but nonetheless, that's roughly being doubled by the success rate of psilocybin. So you'll have to stay tuned for the ultimate final sample in this study, but so far it's extremely encouraging. So based on those data and the other work in the field, we were lucky to receive what we believe to be the first instance of the United States government funding therapeutic research administering a classic psychedelic compound like psilocybin or LSD for a therapeutic purpose. And so that was to continue this line of work. Where we've initiated this trial. It's ongoing. It's a multi-site trial. This is a double-blind study. It's 66 treatment-resistant smokers. It's at 3 sites: Johns Hopkins, University of Alabama, Birmingham, and New York University, with some very great colleagues at those institutions. It's using cognitive behavioral therapy. It's involving 2 sessions of psilocybin treatment, which we think is sort of the sweet spot. We've done studies now with 1 and with 3 sessions. It seems that 2 may be what you need, and you may not need more than that. And people are randomized to either psilocybin or niacin as an active placebo or an active comparator, something that could potentially fool people into thinking they've gotten the real psilocybin. Nothing's going to be a perfect comparison here. I ultimately think that the real answer we get is kind of by triangulating across different types of experiments. Double-blind studies have their advantages and disadvantages. Comparative efficacy studies and other types of studies have their advantages and disadvantages. And ultimately, that's where we get our answer. But that's what we're doing in this study to attempt at a credible blind condition. We'll be assessing the success of that blind, how many people are truly fooled into what condition they have been assigned. And finally, I'll end with just some bigger thoughts on this field. I discussed some of the more surface level risks, the bad trip, people being destabilized who have schizophrenia, but I've become increasingly concerned over the years about the direction we're going in this field. And I wrote about some of this in an article I published a few years ago, and I'm showing you the title from that work here, and some original artwork. That journal required the authors to submit some original artwork, which is not typical, but that was my drawing here. And it concerns the ethics of how we handle these psychedelic sessions in a secular medical or psychological environment. It's pretty routine. I haven't talked about this much or really at all in this talk, but it's pretty routine for participants in these sessions to come upon what I call the big questions. Does God exist? What's the nature of reality? What's the meaning in life? Not always, but it's very common. And so it's really important how we navigate the metaphysical framing of these sessions. And I'm not providing advices to the churches that Professor BOCKAERT described or others, to shamans. I'm talking to physicians and psychologists that will potentially be implementing this treatment if it's medically approved. I think it's extremely important that we take a metaphysically neutral role. We're not here to deny the person's interpretation. If they think Jesus spoke to their heart in the session, we're not here to say that didn't happen, or if they have insights about the nature of reality or anything. But I'm simply saying we need to let the patient drive the bus on those interpretations, if they're going to have any interpretations. And we need to stop imposing this metaphysical frame. And it's happening too much in the field where investigators are falling into the role of a priest or a guru, talking about the connection between the world's religions and about the core of human spirituality. And we're really stepping outside of our bounds and providing philosophical direction to these treatments that I think can lead in a very problematic way. One common thing, for example, is for research groups to have symbols like the Buddha in the session rooms. I don't have any problem with the Buddha. I think that's perfectly fine if someone's a Buddhist or is interested in the Buddha, if a patient wants to have the Buddha present. But why are we setting this up like a New Age retreat center? I think we need to keep a more neutral framework. We might be offending people, for example, if they're a Muslim or a traditional Christian, or someone like Richard Dawkins, a hardcore atheist. They may look at this and say, well, this isn't for them. And I think that's particularly dangerous. And it's dangerous in part because the scientist or the clinician can fall into the role of being a guru. And we really want to avoid that. And we saw some serious examples of that in the earlier history of this research. And I think we're really falling into that history right now. We need to catch ourselves. When we start talking about that this work is going to save humanity, I think we really need to check our own egos and realize that if the human species has a future, there's going to take a whole lot of people doing a lot of different work outside of psychedelics. I think it can really go to our heads. Oftentimes patients will say these are the most meaningful experiences of their lives. And I think that can go to your head as a clinician or a scientist. And so I think we need to check ourselves and be humble in doing this work and to not overstate the magnitude of what we're doing. What we should do is try to do some good science that perhaps, depending on the data, can bring a new treatment model that can help a lot of people and tell us some important things about how the brain and the mind work. And I think that's big enough. And with that, I'll thank you all.
On a le temps pour quelques questions. Merci beaucoup.
We do have time for a few questions. Thank you so much, Matthew.
En attendant un instant que les gens formulent leurs questions.
Now let's wait for people to think about their questions, but I'm going to ask one myself in English.
How do you prepare the patients to the potential changes in their metaphysical beliefs if there's a risk of such phenomenon? How do you prepare the patients to those very strong experiences that might change their worldview?
Yeah, how do we prepare people for experiences that can change their worldview? I think the important thing, and I should say,
Okay, can you use
Oh,
yeah, thank you.
apologies. How do we prepare people for potentially metaphysical sort of world-changing views? One, not everyone has world-changing views. I'll say that as someone who's actually been in the room with over 100 of these patients, so I know what it's like up close, it's not necessary to provide guidance on those things. The necessary thing is to develop a rapport, a relationship, a professional relationship under the right boundaries with that person so that they feel completely safe. They could cry like a baby, which happens during these sessions. They can laugh hysterically and everything in between. So they could share their deep secrets in this professional context. And you're there to support them, but you don't have to provide any guidance. I've never had anyone say, you know, Matt, please tell me whether my vision of whatever, of God, of these other dimensions maybe that they see during these sessions, is that real or not? I don't think we need to play that role. And I don't, if you frame it right, I don't think people expect you to play that role. I
But
simply
you-
put it in their hands. I say, if you have an experience, I can tell you what brain receptor is activated. But in terms of these philosophical questions, your opinion is as valid as anybody else on the planet, including any scientist. That's what I tell them.
Still, you might have to warn the patients that they might have this kind of
Yes.
experiences.
So yes, and you let them know about the magnitude that often comes with these experiences, that people will often describe them as indescribable, ineffable. And typically, for better or worse, people have heard the hype. They've heard about the positive side, about the visions of a larger reality and all of this. So typically people understand that side of it. But I do really emphasize how frightening it can potentially be as well during the experience.
At the French Psychedelic Society, we run integration circles where people with challenging experiences come, and we have a lot of people coming that are disturbed by their recreative psychedelic experiences. So
Right.
I think I have a concern about making people feel lost in reality.
Right. And so that's something I didn't have time to explain, so I'm glad you brought it up. Part of those weeks of continuing discussion, part of that is discussion helping them stay quit from smoking, but it's also checking in with them to see how they're doing, to have discussions about their experience. And part of that is having your clinical radar up to see if they're having any problems like this. And sometimes people, it's more common outside of research because we do have this careful guidance and preparation, but where people will have a psychedelic experience and they are destabilized in life, even if they're not meeting any specific, I mean, sometimes they do have diagnosable psychiatric issues like derealization or delusions, but sometimes they just feel like they've had a midlife crisis, like something's been put in their lap that's very difficult to handle, and they need professional support, or at least the support of understanding friends, family, people. So it's something not to be taken lightly. And sometimes people are surprised. They just think they're going to have some fun or think it's going to be curious, and they'll have a philosophical experience. And sometimes something that comes up, for example, is like a traumatic experience from decades ago can become a big focus, and they have to process that now. They didn't want it to come up, but now they're dealing with this, like, sort of, I'm not talking about recovered memories or anything like that. I'm talking about trauma that they had experienced, they remembered, but they just sort of had put it in the basement, so to speak. But now it's sort of front and center psychologically, and they should deal with that. They need to sort of process it in order to move forward. So one might find that they have to go into additional therapy. Even if you come into this study to quit smoking, but you have one of these experiences come up, you might find that you're called to do additional therapy to deal with some other psychological issue that you had during the experience. So warning people about all this is my ultimate answer. So we have a very long consent process, and it's not just a form, it's real discussion with people about all of these big picture aspects.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there are questions, yes?
Thank you, Matt. Gavin Bart from Hennepin Healthcare, University of Minnesota. Wonder if you could take me through the thought exercise when it came to discussions about an appropriate control. So you could do pseudoephedrine, you could do niacin. Has there been the discussion about heavy sedation as the control and that everyone gets psilocybin?
Yeah.
But some remain conscious for the experience and others are unconscious and therefore don't get the experience. So the commonality is the pharmacology.
So that's actually been explored only a few days ago. Really great researcher, Boris Heifetz at Stanford University, published a study with ketamine, not with psilocybin, but with ketamine doing exactly that, administering that people who were scheduled for surgery, but who also happened to be depressed, but they had another type of surgery for some other illness. And so they delivered ketamine during anesthesia. And actually, they found that both groups decreased in depression, but the placebo and ketamine groups looked identical, really raising some intriguing questions about both the role of the conscious experience during this, the role of placebo effect or expectancy. So my biggest answer is we have a lot of work to do, and there's no perfect experiment to tease this out, but people are trying lots of different ideas. It was mentioned the non-psychedelic analogs to see if just activating the 2A receptor, serotonin 2A receptor without the experience has a future. My bets are that if you saw any effect there, it would be short-term. You wouldn't be seeing these results months or a year later of behavioral benefit without that experience, but that's just a guess at this point. In terms of our grant, Frank, it's a dance between. We knew that the NIA, the FDA, so we have to please multiple agencies. The FDA's best guess was using a very, very tiny dose of the psychedelic itself, like a small dose of psilocybin, or niacin was what they thought were the best options. So it's kind of a dance between doing something that they are interested in, but also what the NIH reviewers are going to be satisfied with, because you have to get a decent score to be considered for funding. So yeah, niacin isn't perfect. People can read on Wikipedia what a niacin flush is, and theoretically, maybe even it's worse than having a true placebo, because you actually have something, if you know about it, you could recognize, but nonetheless, we're going to be assessing the credibility of the blind. I'll say that too, and I'll consider myself guilty with others. We need to do a better job in the field of simply assessing the blind. We need to stop avoiding asking the question because we know the answer is not going to look good. So a lot of studies don't even ask whether, what do you believe? Do you think you got the real thing? Do you think you got placebo? I published a paper about a year ago assessing all of the history of control conditions and found that most studies don't even ask when they have a blind condition, don't even ask about the credibility of the blind. But once you have those data, then you can do things like statistically look at the correlation between correctly guessing and therapeutic outcomes. So you can do some things to start to address it.
Est-ce qu'on a encore un peu de temps pour une ou deux questions brèves?
Maybe one or two very brief questions.
Hi. Thank you for this very interesting talk. My name is Roberta Gabbio and I come from Cagliari, Italy. And I have two different questions for you. The first is, even if your aim was to reduce smoking, if you observed any effect in the use of other substances like alcohol, for instance. And the second is if you observe any gender differences in your patients. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have received reports in our smoking cessation studies of people, usually alcohol, saying that they now drink less or they've stopped drinking. The caveat to that is that we exclude people with a use disorder. So if people are a habitual user of another substance, it's not meeting clinically concerning criteria. And so it's, and if there are people who are using other substances, that's idiosyncratic, it differs across the individuals because we're not targeting it. So basically these are anecdotes, but yes, there are people who say, wow, even though I wasn't looking to stop drinking, I realized I needed to drink less or to stop drinking altogether. We have seen people that say this, but I view that as in line with other changes. Sometimes people say, wow, I really need to improve my diet. And so various health behavior changes, people will, not everybody, but anecdotally, some people will say that these other things, that they need to exercise more. Like they'll have this kind of big picture effect of like, wow, I keep going day to day to day in kind of the habit of life, and I'm not stepping back and seeing, wow, I'm really going down a bad path. I'm not exercising, I'm not eating right, and smoking is just one problem. So sometimes people have that, but it's hard to really assess in such a, when that's not the target and in a small study. And the other thing is gender differences. We have not seen any strong gender differences in our clinical work. So it's something to keep looking at. There's some rodent research suggesting there may be some gender differences in some of the therapeutic models, but so far I don't see any hint of that in the human clinical research.
Okay, now maybe we could leave time for our last speaker. Maybe one last question, very short answer, if possible. Yes, the very last one, very short, if possible, and then
short question and short answer.
Dr. Henri, Addiction Neuchâtel, how last is psilocybin session?
How long does the session itself? So how long does the psilocybin last? About 5 to 6 hours. Thank you. That was something I should have mentioned. So, people essentially come in the early morning and they're ready to leave at about 5 o'clock. So it sort of takes a whole work day, so to speak. So it's a whole day experience, essentially.
Thank you very much. It was really a short question, short answer. Perfect. So now I can have the time to present Mr. Wim van den Brink. Donc, il me fait grand plaisir de vous présenter notre prochain intervenant, professeur Wim van den Brink, professeur émérite de psychiatrie et de toxicomanie au Centre médical académique de l'Université d'Amsterdam.
Professor Amsterdam, former director of the Amsterdam Institute for Research and director for the treatment of addiction to heroin in Utrecht, and presided the scientific program of the 26th and 27th conference of the biggest neuroscience meeting in Europe. His career illustrates world expertise in neurobiology, in pharmaceutical treatment of dependency. He's played a key role in research and development of treatments, but also worked on implementing them in health units. And amongst his research achievements, he was one of the first to have tested heroin-assisted treatment and deep cerebral.
Récompense inclut le prix Marie Curie pour la neuroimagerie, de la neurotoxicité de l'ecstasy en 2003, le prix scientifique de l'Association psychiatrique des Pays-Bas en 2005 et bien d'autres. Son œuvre prolifique comprend la rédaction de plus de 600 articles évalués par les pairs. Il a occupé des rôles consultatifs pour diverses organisations scientifiques, dont le Conseil consultatif scientifique de l'Institut suisse de recherche en santé publique en toxicomanie. En somme, M. Van den Brink est une figure éminente dans le domaine de la recherche sur la dépendance et nous sommes très honorés de l'avoir avec nous aujourd'hui. Je vous en prie, accueillons le docteur Wim van den Brink.
Thank you very much. The introduction is longer than the talk.
Merci beaucoup. Alors, l'introduction est plus longue que ma communication. Donc, je vais également prolonger un peu le débat, pas seulement pour parler des psychédéliques classiques, mais également voir ce qu'on appelle les psychédéliques atypiques, et passant également, pas seulement du tabac, mais à d'autres substances. Il faut être assez rapide. Voici quelques déclarations. Seules deux sont liées à cette communication. J'ai acheté un conseiller chez Janssen pour la kétamine et j'ai un conseil avec Claremont Médecine qui développe une de ces psychédéliques non typiques en Israël. Donc, ce que je veux vous parler, c'est parler des psychédéliques et l'histoire des psychédéliques. Vous avez déjà entendu la majeure partie de ce que je voulais dire là-dessus. Parler des psychédéliques comme traitement de l'addiction. Et je vais dire quelques mots sur d'autres troubles mentaux parce que, comme vous le savez, les gens avec des addictions ont souvent d'autres problèmes, des dépressions, etc. Donc, les médications s'adressent à une addiction. Médications pour la dépendance à l'alcool ne sont pas testées chez les usagers de médications multiples. Donc, il faut savoir quels sont le rôle des psychédéliques pour les autres troubles mentaux. Quelques mots sur les mécanismes d'action et voir si les psychédéliques pouvaient jouer un rôle dans les problèmes que nous rencontrons dans le traitement des addictions actuellement. Donc, on parle des psychédéliques classiques jusqu'ici, comme le LSD, psilocybine, ayahuasca, les mescalines, 5-MeO, etc. Donc, ce sont les psychédéliques classiques. Et quand les gens parlent de leur trip et de leur expérience, mais c'est également, existe aussi des psychédéliques atypiques, des médicaments qui augmentent les sentiments empathiques, les rapports avec d'autres personnes, comme le MDMA, l'ecstasy, des libérateurs de sérotonine, des composés dissociatifs comme la kétamine, qui ne travaille pas tant sur le système sérotonique, mais sur le système glutamate, d'autres composés qui ont des actions complexes comme l'ibogaïne. Donc, je vais dire quelques mots sur cela. L'histoire des psychédéliques, il y a beaucoup de choses sur ce slide, mais ça vous donne une idée de ce qui a été présenté par les autres intervenants, avec beaucoup d'intérêt pour les études précoces dans les années 50 et 60. Et on voit ici le nombre de publications. Vous voyez qu'il y a beaucoup de publications dans PubMed. Et ici, Monde de Sciences, on voit qu'il y avait pas mal d'études au début et on va regarder l'usage thérapeutique et également regarder les mécanismes et essayer de savoir quels étaient les phénomènes impliqués. Ils pensaient que l'usage des psychédéliques était une expérience qui était similaire à une psychose. C'était erroné, mais ils faisaient ce genre d'études. Ils faisaient également des études chez des patients avec des états dépressifs ou des névroses, et surtout des patients avec une dépendance à l'alcool. Ensuite, les années 60, avec beaucoup de problèmes. Ensuite, la guerre contre la drogue a été proclamée et vous voyez que le nombre de publications a diminué. Et on peut voir qu'il y a également une espèce de crise dans la psychiatrie biologique. Il n'y a pas de nouveaux médicaments qui arrivent. Et on voit une remontée dans le nombre d'études avec des psychédéliques, que ce soit atypiques ou typiques, la renaissance des psychédéliques ou la thérapie de trip, avec beaucoup d'essais randomisés. Donc, voilà un peu rapidement l'histoire. Maintenant, on parle seulement des psychédéliques comme médication. Et donc, c'est le grand problème ici. On voit que dans l'activité des opiacés aux États-Unis,
From medication became a drug, and now we're looking at it again as a medication, and we see this new upsurge of studies maybe when we look at the psychedelic treatment of addictions, some early studies, and I must say most of these studies were of low quality in terms of what we now think is high quality methodological studies, with the exception maybe of some of the alcoholism studies. Actually, very early on, people started to randomized controlled trials already there. And actually, there were some 8 randomized, 8 trials on alcohol dependence, but there were also 6 randomized controlled trials. And basically what they did, there was one session with LSD, a little bit more problematic than psilocybin because it even lasts longer, the session. It lasts between 8 and 10 hours. And that's, I think, why psilocybin is preferred now, because it lasts much shorter. Of 5-MeO-DMT is being used because the psychedelic experience lasts only 15 to 20 minutes, and so the sessions can become much shorter. But there, at that time, they only used LSD without basically psychotherapy, with a pleasant environment. And the outcomes were not completely consistent, but some years ago, 2012, Krebs and Johansson made a meta-analysis of the 6 randomized controlled trials that were available then. And they showed very nice results, actually, both in terms of reduced drinking and continuous abstinence, with very nice results. You see, one dose of LSD gave actually very positive results in both outcomes, up to 6 to 12 months. And they also compared it to the medications that were available at that time for the treatment of alcohol dependence, naltrexone, acamprosate, and disulfiram. And they concluded that the single dose of LSD is probably more effective than continuous treatment with naltrexone, acamprosate, and disulfiram. Although these were nice studies, the outcomes were not so specifically defined, and we have to be careful with that, but it shows that there was, in these early studies, quite some interesting data available. So let's skip this whole period of the darkness, and let's move to the enlightenment of the 20th, 21st century. And let's go to the modern studies and start with ketamine studies. Ketamine studies are around quite a long time, and I must say, most of the studies here, I can present 9 studies, of which 5 clinical randomized controlled trials, 2 lab studies, crossover randomized trial, 1 controlled study, and 1 pre-post study. So a rich array of studies are available with ketamine in addiction treatment. The first studies were actually done in Russia. They were very decent studies, but of course we don't look at them anymore because they came from Russia. But actually, these were quite nice studies that were done. And I think the results are being replicated in the new studies that mainly come from the United States now. So if you look at these ketamine studies, I don't talk about the 2 crossover studies, but there are some nice randomized controlled trials. Now, they're not so big. This is a first randomized controlled trial on cocaine dependence. And what you see, it's a randomized control trial, 55 patients, follow-up of 4 or 5 weeks, 1 intravenous ketamine infusion in the experimental group, and 1 intravenous injection of midazolam as an active placebo, and weekly mindfulness-based relapse prevention sessions. And what you see is a very quick effect, very low dropout rates, 7% compared to 42% in the first 4 weeks. So at least we can retain treatment, but also a large reductions of cocaine use in the first 5 weeks, comparing ketamine, reducing to 40% of the patients still using cocaine, where it is 80–90% in the control condition. If you calculate the number needed to treat, and it's about 3, which is in our field a wonderful results. You have to treat 3 patients to have 1 more success. This was a study that was very much the same setup. It's the same group that did the study, but now not in cocaine dependence, but in alcohol dependence. Study lasting also like 3 weeks, and with an open follow-up of 6 months. And what you see is abstinence over 21 days is 90% versus 60% in the control condition. So again, the numbers needed to treat of 3. And if you look at abstinence at 6 months, then it's 75% versus 27%, which is the numbers needed to treat of 2, which is again a wonderful effect. If you look at heavy drinking days, again, you see a very positive effect. And if you see a relapse over the first 21 days, again, it's a very positive effect in these alcohol treatments. Now, these are very small studies, and this is actually a bigger study by Grabsky in 2022, I think it was. Yeah, it was 2022. And see, this is different kinds of treatment, psychological treatment, and different medications. That's, again, either ketamine or a placebo, again, together with mindful-based relapse prevention versus education, and evidence looking at 3 weeks and 6 months follow-up. And what you see here is, again, a very positive outcome. Now over not only 3 months, but also over 6 months. So you see 3 weekly ketamine infusion leading to very long-term effects on alcohol use. In terms of illicit, there was some anxiety that people might become addicted to ketamine. And there were, indeed, in the follow-up period, there were 6 patients who started to use ketamine, but it was equally divided between the ketamine and the placebo condition. So it's hard to blame the ketamine treatment for that. This is the smallest study. This is in cannabis, 2 injection of ketamine, first with 71 milligrams per kilogram, and if non-responder in week 4, an intravenous injection with 140 milligrams per kilogram. And you see again a large reduction. Now, this is not a randomized trial. This is just a pre-post study, so we have to be very careful. But again, you see a similar signal that we saw with cocaine and alcohol. So this is an interesting finding that one medication doesn't seem only to help with one substance of abuse, but different substances of abuse, in this case, alcohol, cocaine, and cannabis. Now, there's also quite some studies done now with no, sorry, I have to say, there is only one study done with MDMA, and that's the study of Ben Sessa. And you see this is a pre-post study. People started to use MDMA after detoxification, and just using 2 sessions of MDMA with supported psychotherapy. They used regular doses of MDMA, and you see the alcohol use over 9 months went down from 131 to 19 units of alcohol per week. And also they report that there is some improvement of social functioning. Now we go to psilocybin, and this is now we're coming to the studies that have been shown before. Let's go first to the tobacco. This is the study that was presented and in much more detail than I ever can do. So very nicely study, and actually an impressive result in a pre-post study. That's also the weakness of it, that it's a pre-post study, but I think Matthew has shown it very clearly. Similarly, in alcohol dependency psilocybin study, small study, only 10 patients, but you see again a quick improvement of alcohol, stopping with alcohol use, and 2 sessions of psilocybin with psychotherapy having a lasting effect for 4 to 6 months. Again, a pre-post study, we have to be careful, but it's a similar signal what we get. Now, this becomes more interesting now. This is the first randomized controlled trial in alcohol-dependent patients with psilocybin done by the group of Michael Bogenschutz. And so this is a study duration of 12 weeks and a treatment-free follow-up period of 20 weeks, comparing 12 weeks of motivation enhancement therapy and cognitive behavior therapy, 2 sessions of psilocybin versus the same psychotherapy with 2 active placebo sessions with diphenhydramine. And so they were basically looking at the percentage of heavy drinking days between week 5 after the last psilocybin sessions and week 32. And so what you saw there is outcomes in terms of percentage heavy drinking days, percentage of drinking days and drinks per day, with effect sizes that I think are higher than we generally see in the treatment of alcohol dependence, where effect sizes range from, say, 0.30 to 0.40, and here you see effect sizes 0.40 to 0.50. So again, and now in a randomized controlled trial. Now, there was always a problem. This was a study where they tried to blind the treatment, and of course, they failed in blinding, but they also had some objective outcomes at least. So some of the information bias you don't have, and if they use the objective output, ethyl glucuronide, then the outcomes were very similar. So it's at least an attempt to deal with blinding and at least providing objective and not subjective outcomes. This is one of the few ibogaine studies. You see there have been something like 4 uncontrolled ibogaine studies, both on detox of opiate dependence, but also on relapse prevention. I will show data from the largest and the most recent one, study from Brown and Alper. This is the study. It included 30 patients that received ibogaine. And what you see is there is a high dropout from 30 patients that pre-treatment till only 14 patients, 12 months follow-up. But of these 12 patients, 7 were still totally abstinent over the 12-month period. So you can see that at least 20%, 23% were still abstinent after 1 session of ibogaine. Again, it's a pre-post study. You have to be very careful, but there is a clear signal that it might do something in terms of abstinence. Now, there is a big warning there. There is a long history of cardiovascular problems with ibogaine. Not a lot of good studies. It's probably one of the first ones. This is from the Netherlands. And they had 14 patients in an inpatient setting with opiate dependence. They converted from methadone to morphine, and then they had 1 session with ibogaine and followed them in clinical observation for 24 hours. And they saw very serious clinical relevant elongations of the QT interval in the ECG. So they concluded that there is a serious and a substantial cardiac risk requested by the use of ibogaine. So if there is any sessions going around here, there is some retreats that still use ibogaine, I think you should really warn patients because this is a very risky treatment. If you want to read more about it, this is a very extensive report on the adverse events of the literature on side effects of ibogaine. So what are the conclusions if you think about addiction and psychedelics? I would say with regard to the atypical psychedelics, I think ketamine, there is relatively many good but generally small studies available now on heroin, alcohol, cocaine, and cannabis, with mainly rapid and large and sustained effects. So the ketamine studies, and I think it's very promising. With MDMA, I think there's only 1 small pre-post study, and so it's too early to say anything about that. Ibogaine, there might be some positive effects, but I would warn against using it given the high risk of cardiac problems. With regard to the classic psychedelics, I think LSD studies are old, but relatively good quality, and they show a very good signal. And that is why, of course, people start to look at psilocybin. I think we have now 2 small pre-post studies, 1 randomized control trial with a rapid and sustained effect, also indicated that mystical experience might be a driving force in these effects. But we still have to wait. There's a new randomized control trial coming now on tobacco use, so it's a very interesting way to go. I think there are new studies starting now with 5-MeO-DMT, which is really very exciting because these treatments, they're not simple and they're quite expensive. Sitting 6 hours with 2 therapists with a patient is quite an investment. And if you can reduce that to maybe 15, 20 minutes with some extension to an hour, that would be quite some some effect. Ayahuasca, I think there's no effect studies available yet. And so my conclusion with regard to addiction is that it's promising what's going on, but it's far away from standard routine clinical application at this moment. This is, people start to think how you can integrate psychedelic session also in standard treatment. So this is just a position paper from the field of the AA field and in the 12-step program. And so it's clear that they say we can use psychedelics in certain phases of the 12-step program, like in step 2, where we're talking about surrendering oneself to recovery. That might be a moment where you might use psilocybin, or in the 12th step where it's about spiritual awakening. So they start to think how to integrate psychedelics into the standard treatment that we have available in addiction treatments. Now, I said it's also important to know what's going on in the other fields outside of addiction, because you know just as well as I do that we see very few patients with just an addiction. They come with depression, they come with PTSD, they come with OCD, they come with all kinds of disorders. So what is going on in the other fields? And I'm not going to give a full overview like I did before with the addiction, but give some highlights of what's going on there. And it's going very fast there. Like for ketamine and depression, you see there's loads of studies, and one of these forms, there is intravenous use, there is oral use, there is intranasal use, and the intranasal ketamine has been registered by the FDA and the EMA as an additional treatment to regular antidepressants in patients with treatment-resistant depression. So you say, here's the first psychedelic that is registered for standard treatment in psychiatry. With regard to psilocybin, I think it's a little bit complicated. This was the first large randomized control trial that was published in New England Journal of Medicine in 2021 with very complicated findings. It was a comparison between psilocybin and escitalopram, and they defined the primary outcome. And as you can see, this is the data on the primary outcome, and you see, oh, I have to go back. And you see here at the final outcome moment, there is no significant difference. And that I think was disappointing, although almost all the secondary outcomes were in favor of the psilocybin. So it's very difficult. It's hard to interpret. And so we need more studies on that. And there were more studies. This was one of the most recent trials. That's a study by Goodwin. I think you already mentioned that, which was a phase 2 double-blind randomized controlled trial. With it says 33, but there was 333 treatment-resistant patients with a single dose of 25 milligrams psilocybin, comparing it with 10 milligram and 1 milligram psilocybin, all with psychosocial support, but not too much, not like complex psychological treatment. And this study showed a clear effect in favor of the 25 milligrams, which might also be a warning to people who think a lot about microdosing. The 10 milligram didn't do anything. So if you think that microdosing is working, this is at least a signal that it might not. This is a summary that I made from the data. And what you see is actually that the effect sizes they're good, but a little less good than we expected and that we have seen with the MDMA trials, with the ketamine trials in alcohol dependence. But still, very acceptable response rates in depression, like numbers needed to treat ranging from 5 to 7, which is better than most of the antidepressants that we know. This is the most recent one, actually, a phase 2 trial with 101 patients. Again, a single dose of 25 milligrams psilocybin versus single dose of niacin. All patients receive the same amount and type of psychotherapy. And you see that here, very nice effect sizes. You see very fast effects. It's not only that the effect is large, but you see also it's in the first week you see a dramatic reduction in depression symptoms. And if you look at the sustained depressive symptoms response, you see a numbers needed to treat of 3, and sustained depressive symptom remission, complete remission of symptoms, you see a numbers needed to treat of 6, which both are very, very substantial effects. If you look at MDMA and the treatment of PTSD, PTSD is very common in our patients with problems of alcohol or drug problems. You see, again, very interesting. This is a first phase 3 trial with 90 patients, patients with PTSD and comorbid disorders, 3 MDMA sessions versus placebo, and 15 identical psychotherapy sessions. The effects are immense, I would say. This is what they show as effect sizes. PTSD reduction symptoms with a d-value of 0.91, which is a very large effect size. Also, in terms of functioning, you see actually that there is already in the first few weeks, there is improvement of functioning of a d-value of 0.40. And also depression is going down with the large effect size. So if you look at that in terms of remission, you see effect sizes with numbers needed to treat ranging from 3 to 4, which again looks very promising. This was a little side study on it. There were some patients, they didn't have alcohol use disorder, but they did have symptoms of alcohol use disorder, some of the patients. And they didn't only have a large reduction of the PTSD symptoms, but also in terms of their alcohol use, in this case, in terms of alcohol symptoms, there was a significant reduction in this group, which is a promising finding for us in addiction medicine. This is the latest MDMA trial in severe PTSD. It's a second phase 3 trial now with MDMA versus placebo. The design and the outcome study was the same as I presented before, but here the study sample was more varied. It was a multi-ethnic sample. So we have to realize that most of these studies altogether in psychedelic research are in white people and often in private practices. So it's not automatically transferable to other ethnic groups and other treatment conditions. But again, this is the second phase 3 trial of MDMA on PTSD. And you see again, it's the same kind of effect sizes that you see here on PTSD, large effect size, on social functioning, a small to moderate effect size. And you see, in terms of numbers needed to treat, loss of diagnosis, numbers needed to treat 4, and remission, numbers needed to treat is 4. So I expect that MDMA-assisted psychotherapy will be registered in 2024 by the FDA based on these large randomized control phase 3 trials. So how is it with safety of these studies? It is a review that we published recently. We looked at 44 studies on serotonergic classic psychedelics and MDMA. 44 study, 36 quantitative study, and 10 studies that had only qualitative or also qualitative findings. The side effects looks actually very modest, very small in terms of the real problems. Acute adverse events are basically nausea, headache, and anxiety during the session. I think it's a serious issue. It's not a small issue, but it's very well containable in the context of decent clinical practice. More important is, of course, the late adverse events, that is a month to 6 months after the sessions. And with psilocybin, we see nausea, headache, and still in some patients, continuing anxiety that need attention. And with MDMA, it's slightly different. We see fatigue and sometimes sadness, although it's not clear what is left of the original problem and what is new. But again, it needs it's not small things. It's not dramatic. It's not very. There's only in all these studies there was one serious adverse event. but patients showed full recovery, so it's very comforting in that sense. We also did a comparison between ketamine in recreational use and in treatment use, and we got the impression, because there is some some risk of addictive problems with ketamine. We didn't see any indication of addiction with clinical use of ketamine so far. So mechanisms of action, we talked a lot about it, so I think I have no time to do that. We have to, of course, understand why it seems to work against everything, but I will finally have this this last slide, and that is what are the problems that we encounter in the pharmacological treatment of addictive patients? I think we have a lot of effective treatments now, but there is low treatment retention and there is high dropout, which is a serious problem. But with psychedelics, the effects seem to occur very rapidly, and there is a low risk of early dropout. So that's a big advantage. We have many available treatments in addiction, but there is a limited effect size, and the effects are of short duration. Now, with these psychedelics, we see large effect size and long-lasting effects, even after 1 to 3 sessions. So again, a big advantage. We have lots of comorbidity and very little evidence of an effective treatment of our patients with a comorbidity. And so psychedelics seem to be effective in addiction and in other mental disorders. And finally, and maybe that's one of the most important, we have a lot of polydrug addiction that we see now, and our medications are basically all directed to one of these substances. And it seems that psychedelics can be effective in different addictions. And I've shown the data for that. So here we see really an interesting development, and these are my conclusions. And the most important is actually that psychedelics, when they come, and it's not soon, I have to warn you, they will come, but it's not soon, and they will not be without problems. But if they're being introduced, we have a potential better way of treatment of our patients with addictive problems, with comorbid depression and PTSD and polydrug use. So there is a promise there, but this is probably the best way to show it. It's very promising, but it's still a long way to go, and there's a lot of ethical and practical problems we overcome before we have these medications available as standard normal treatment. Thank you very much.
Très bien. Eh bien, merci à toutes et à tous d'avoir.
Thank you very much, all of you, for having attended this panel on psychedelics. I'm sure that we will be able to ask questions when we meet during the break. And I think we're going to continue now with the next panel. Thank you very much, all three of you. And see you very soon for the second session of this morning.